disaster happens, it becomes news around the globe. Whether it's the scale or the spectacle.
Look at the debris. Look at all the debris. Look at
the
all
financial
the debris.
cost or the lives lost. These massive events fill mankind with fascination and fear. In this series, we're looking at some of the biggest disasters to ever strike the planet.
Hurricane Katrina, the monster storm, downgraded during the night, but she is still a very dangerous storm.
Over the next hour, you'll see the devastation wreaked by winds that exceed the speed of a racing car, huge storms that cover half a continent, and cyclones that drop a year's worth of rain in a single day. Strap yourselves in and hold on tight to something secure, because today we're going to look at the top 10 hurricanes of all time. Hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons. These are just different names used around the world for the tropical storms that generate winds over 118 kilometers per hour. These storms can only form over water that's 26 degrees Celsius or warmer, restricting them to the zone between the tropics. And they unleash a gargantuan amount of energy.
I think this is a very scary storm, even for people who've been in a lot of storms.
With winds that exceed 150 kilometers per hour, and rainfall so heavy it can deluge entire regions with as much as 1 meter per day, the average hurricane releases enough energy to power the entire world for months. These are some of the most intense, destructive, and deadly weather events on the planet. To determine the #1 storm event, we'll look at all aspects of these megastorms. These include their size, speed, and power, as well as the human and financial costs. We'll also consider some of their surprising after effects. So, as the storm clouds gather, let's have a look at number 10 on our list. At number 10, we have a cyclone that rocked the state of Florida in 1992. Hurricane Andrew. Like all tropical cyclones, Andrew began when the air over warm water rose rapidly, pushing cooler air downward and forming cyclonic winds. Then, as the developing storm neared the warm waters of the Bahamas, it suddenly gained strength. Then, in a little over 24 hours, it escalated to the strongest hurricane status, Category 5. After leaving a trail of destruction across several islands in the Bahamas, Andrew made landfall in South Florida, where it would do the majority of its damage.
From Hurricane Andrew is now up to 8. 60%.
Florida is used to hurricanes. In fact, 88% of all hurricanes that land in the U.S. strike either Florida or Texas. So what made Andrew stand apart from all the others? One word: carnage.
It's about 8:30, and we're going to tell you that parts of Ocean Drive are basically impassable. It's not a good idea to get out here at this hour.
Winds reached an incredible 280 kilometers per hour, destroying everything in their path.
For some time.
Cancel all elective surgery for tomorrow. There is now a boil water order.
In its 12-hour journey across Florida and Louisiana, Andrew ripped apart thousands of homes. Even the strongest buildings could not withstand the power of the cyclone. Even worse was in store for thousands of Floridians who lived in mobile homes. Mobile homes that were in Andrew's path didn't stand a chance, reduced to splinters. Thousands of families lost everything. It's estimated that 25,000 people permanently left Florida.
Devastation, the twisted metal, roofs blown off homes.
Hurricanes are indiscriminate, though, so nature itself was also punished. In the Everglades, 30,000 hectares of trees were felled, making the landscape unrecognizable and changing an entire ecosystem for a generation. In Louisiana, the bayou suffered terribly. Nearly 200 million freshwater fish were killed, and 15,000 boats were destroyed. Some businesses would never recover, You don't have to have your home destroyed to lose everything. Fortunately, hurricanes can't travel far once they move inland. They're powered by the warm water of the seas, so once they lose access to their ocean fuel, all they're doing is losing vast amounts of energy. But that fact alone doesn't make inland areas safe. In a deadly twist, Andrew caused even more death and devastation when it spawned more than 60 powerful tornadoes that tore through neighboring states.
Baptist Hospital, where the victims of Hurricane Andrew are just coming by the dozens. During the time that we were there were 50 people crowded into the emergency.
By the time Andrew and all its offshoots had exhausted their energy, 65 people were dead. At the time, experts assessed the damage at $25 billion, the equivalent of $55 billion today. Hurricane Andrew is still considered one of the most destructive hurricanes in U.S. history. At number 9, we have an entry that technically is not a hurricane. The great storm that caused devastation in the UK and France in 1987. Because of the warm water and steady winds required to form tropical storms, it's very rare for them to ever make landfall as far north as Europe. But subtropical storms can bring hurricane-force winds. This storm even taught meteorologists a thing or two, despite what Michael Fish of the BBC told the British public on the evening news.
Good afternoon to you. Earlier on today, apparently a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said
the truth was, hurricane-strength forces were on their way, and they were going to wreak havoc.
At least 17 people have been killed and hundreds injured by the worst storms to hit Britain in nearly 300 years.
When the storm hit northern France and southern England in the early hours of October 16th, it brought winds of up to 130 kilometers per hour. That was the strength of a Category 3 hurricane.
This kind of storm only strikes once every 200 years.
These once in every 200-year winds were caused by an undiscovered at the time phenomenon called a sting jet. A sting jet happens when very cold air falls into a storm front and adds power. And on this occasion, lots of power. Thousands of buildings were damaged, ships were wrecked in harbors, and more than 15 million trees were uprooted. A figure so high it shook confidence in the global timber market. There was chaos everywhere you looked.
En 24 heures, la tempête a littéralement balayé tout l'ouest de la France.
Fortunately, the storm hit in the middle of the night, when most people are safe at home.
Zone entièrement dévastée, arbres et
As a
toitures
result,
arrachées,
the
bateaux à la
loss of
dérive.
life was relatively low. Only 18 killed in the UK and 22 in France. But that was the only good timing the storm
Trains
demonstrated.
in and out of
Britain
London were
woke up to a
cancelled, and in the
crippled
city.
transport network. Millions couldn't go to work, and as a result, the London Stock Exchange closed early. Ordinarily, that would be an inconvenience rather than a problem. But on this occasion, the New York Stock Exchange was in the middle of an historic plummet. London's inability to respond to Wall Street impacted markets across the globe. London was unable to react until its market reopened the following Monday. That day became known as Black Monday. Over the days following the storm, more than $4 trillion was wiped from exchanges around the world. Millions were left bankrupt.
But experts say it's not going to be confined to wealthy.
Would that have happened if the Great Storm hadn't struck? It's impossible to say. But if we attribute any of Black Monday to the Great Storm, that would make it far and away the most costly storm in human history. When hurricanes strike regions of poverty, the danger they present is magnified and the damage multiplied. That's what happened with number 8 on our list, Cyclone Idai of 2019. Most of the time, the cyclones that form over the waters of the Indian Ocean approach the African coasts and then head west again. But Idai, in orange, changed course and turned around to hit the mainland. For 2 weeks in March of 2019, the tropical storm that became Cyclone Idai terrorized Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi in Southeast Africa. Those winds of 190 kilometers per hour were much weaker than those of Hurricane Andrew.
In the Mozambique port city of Beira and
across the region, hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed and millions were left homeless. There were more than 1,000 people killed, many by flying debris from these ramshackle houses.
The huge logistic.
These figures could actually be far greater, as they're impossible to verify. The homes were handmade, and the records were incomplete. However, the worst damage was caused by floodwaters. Southern Africa was in drought, and such dry ground is prone to flooding. While hurricanes are out at sea, they gather up huge volumes of water, and sooner or later what goes up must come down.
The rain is making Chizine's job that much harder.
The torrential rain from Idai caused major problems, but it was the cyclone storm surge that delivered Armageddon.
The power of the storm surge way back in 2016, getting out of the way, was what exactly is a storm surge?
All tropical storms generate storm surges, a combination of the high winds pushing the surface water and low air pressure causing sea levels to rise. This combination makes tides significantly higher than normal. As a result, water can sometimes surge hundreds of kilometers inland.
This is what storm surge looks like. It's a fast-moving, fast-rising flash flood.
In Mozambique, a storm surge of 4.5 meters hit a region where much of the land is below sea level. The floods were so vast, they could be seen from space. Entire cities were completely cut off. One of Mozambique's most important cities, Beira, was practically destroyed in its entirety.
The country's infrastructure ripped up, obliterated.
The country was brought to its knees.
People's lives pulled apart and destroyed.
Tropical cyclone Kenneth swept over the Comoros Islands off Africa's east coast on Wednesday.
Unbelievably, just 6 weeks later, as survivors attempted to salvage what they could from their wrecked communities, they were hit by Cyclone Kenneth. The only reason it was less destructive was simply that there was little left to destroy.
Heavy rains and powerful winds, it tore down homes, trees.
The impact of Idai was so widespread and devastating that a year later, more than 100,000 people were still homeless, with 9 million having no access to clean water.
Thousands of people have had little or no food, medicine, and other essentials.
It's estimated that Cyclone Idai killed just under 2,000 people. It made 3 million people homeless and caused over $2 billion in damage. But that's $2 billion in a country where the average wage is less than $10 per week. Comparatively, the damage done was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. As Idai demonstrated, it's not just the strength of the hurricane that quantifies its impact. The relative strength of the region's economy can be just as big a factor.
Right now, it is the worst that I have seen. I can hear the roofing of buildings here in San Juan coming off.
If a hurricane is heading towards you, your best advice is to get out of its way. But our number 7 storm shows that's not always possible. It's Hurricane Maria that struck Puerto Rico in 2017. Puerto Rico is a small, densely populated American territory on the edge of the Caribbean, and right in the middle of a hurricane hotspot. Most of the time, the island's diminutive size works in its favor, and it only suffers glancing blows every 6 or 7 years. But when you live in the path of hurricanes, sooner or later, your luck is going to run out. And in September 2017, Lady Luck turned against Puerto Rico in a big way. Hurricane strength is measured from categories 1 to 5 on the severe
Look at this
scale.
powerful Hurricane Maria making landfall right now on Puerto Rico.
With one being fairly weak winds of 63 kilometers per hour and any winds over 251 kilometers per hour labeled as Category 5. Winds can get a lot faster than that, but the scale stops at 5 because the fact is, once you're over that threshold, the damage is comprehensive. 2 weeks earlier, Puerto Rico had just been lashed by the tail of a Category 5 hurricane named Irma. Then Maria came, and the island was devastated by another Category 5 that landed with full force and wreaked havoc. The eye of the storm, famed for its eerie calm, but surrounded by the most powerful winds located in the eye wall, was directly over land for the duration of Maria's passage. Early on, during what's called an eye wall renewal cycle, the eye tripled in size, making the storm much more powerful, packing intensified winds across a diameter of more than 80 kilometers. Puerto Rico is only 56 kilometers wide. As Maria cut a swath from one end of the island to the other, it passed over mountains. These served to slow the winds down, but squeezed ever more rainfall from the storm. Some areas received as much as a meter of rain in 24 hours. That's about 1 million tons of water for every square mile. That's the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool being emptied onto an area the size of New York's Central Park every 90 seconds for an entire day.
All day, army trucks went back and forth through the floodwaters, bringing out people who had spent a terrifying 24 hours. First in the storm, then in the floods, and then waiting for help to come.
Streams were instantly transformed into rivers, and what were once roads and town squares quickly became lakes. Maria's advance was slowed by the mountains, which caused the storm to linger over the island and batter its communities with continued wind and rainfall. By the time the storm had moved on, nearly every one of the 3.4 million residents felt its impact.
And this is why, in this neighborhood near the capital, everything is gone.
The neighboring island of the Dominican Republic declared that they had lost everything money could buy. In fact, every house on the island is damaged and all their crops destroyed. The damage was assessed at over twice as much as the tiny nation's entire GDP. It forced them to change the entire basis of their economy.
The entire country has been reduced to a debris field.
Puerto Rico suffered thanks to its dramatically higher and more densely packed population. Over 3,000 were killed, and it was many months before electricity and communications were fully restored. The damage was put conservatively at $90 billion.
People looking for help, too grateful.
For Puerto Ricans and the islands around them, those few days with Maria likely determined their fortunes for decades to come. Of what the future might hold for Puerto Rico, we need only look at the countries of Honduras and Nicaragua, who were hit by our number 6 storm in 1998, Hurricane Mitch. Central America is one of the world's most impoverished regions, and Honduras, one of its poorest countries. If it was subjected to a direct hit by a hurricane, it was always going to be bad. But Hurricane Mitch was catastrophic. Formed in the heart of the Caribbean, Mitch is a monster. While approaching Central America, it had an eye 30 kilometers in diameter and was more than 80 kilometers wide. It was a Category 5 storm, with winds topping out at 300 kilometers per hour. Clearly, wherever this superstorm made landfall, serious trouble would follow. Then suddenly, it slowed down. By the time Mitch hit Honduras, its winds had slowed to Category 2 status, and it seemed like disaster might be averted. But that was before the rain started. As the storm built to a vast size and power over the Caribbean Sea, it engulfed billions of gallons of seawater. As it slowed down, it could no longer hold the water. The rain that followed was inevitable. The deluge lasted for 3 full days. Over those 3 days, the highest official measure of rain in some regions was reported to be 2 meters of rain per day. No place on Earth could withstand such a cataclysm. That's what faced the inhabitants of Honduras and neighboring Nicaragua.
And of course, there is the overriding need for food and for medicine. Without it, these people will not be able to help themselves.
Entire communities were destroyed within hours from mudslides and floods with water 12 meters deep. Nationwide, Honduras lost 75% both of its transportation network and all its crops, and rendered a quarter of its population homeless. 2 million people made destitute because of rain.
Villages where entire homes and families are no more.
President Flores, who had been overseeing a growing economy, claimed that this single storm had cost his country 50 years of progress. Hurricanes can simultaneously wipe away history and devastate the future. Despite the storm's relatively weak wind speeds, over 11,000 people in Honduras and Nicaragua were killed, and as many were listed as missing. Hurricane Mitch became the deadliest Atlantic hurricane in over 200 years. The damage to property and infrastructure ran to the billions. But when a nation's entire economy is pulverized by an event like this, it's impossible to put a true figure on the economic consequences. 25 years later, those countries are still suffering the after effects of Mitch. At number 5, we're going to see what happens when a hurricane strikes the world's richest city, Hurricane Sandy, which hit Cuba, Haiti, and the USA in 2012.
There is something potentially scary brewing in the Atlantic Ocean.
Conditions this year are similar to 1991, the year of the perfect storm.
Modern satellite imagery and modeling technology allows meteorologists to more accurately predict which storms are likely to become hurricanes and predict the paths they're likely to take. However, these cyclones can still offer a few unpredictable surprises, and Sandy had plenty.
That's not a very good direction. It's a very unusual one.
We watch it, we watch it, we watch it, we watch it.
Okay, great to have you with us tonight, Sam. Thank you.
In October of 2012, it was a Category 3 hurricane that very quickly made landfall in Cuba, Haiti, and Jamaica. Sandy caused widespread damage across these islands, destroying populated areas and leaving upwards of 200,000 homeless, but amazingly, only caused 60 deaths. After its journey across those islands, Sandy appeared to be petering out, was on course to be just another fairly standard Atlantic hurricane. But Sandy's trajectory took it to the United States, and what happened next
Sunday
made
night
it
into
historical.
Monday, and that's when things could definitely get a little bit tricky.
Thanks to unusually warm waters along the eastern coast of the U.S., Sandy regained her strength and hurricane status, deluging every coastal state all the way up to the Canadian border.
The Mid-Atlantic region is bracing for Sandy, a slow-moving monster of unprecedented size and scope.
This is a rare phenomenon, but not unheard of.
It's likely to continue to intensify.
However, when it hit the northeast USA, it combined with a cold air storm coming down from the north to form what was called at the time a Frankenstorm.
By next splashing over the seawalls at the tip of lower Manhattan.
It consisted of snow, wind, and rain. Statistically, Sandy is the largest storm ever recorded. It had gale-force winds across a 1,600-kilometer diameter. The storm's size would have covered all of Central Europe, from Edinburgh to Marseille and Barcelona to Berlin. A storm with such power and fury could only be fatal. When Sandy made landfall on the coast of New Jersey, it had the perfect conditions for an equally monstrous storm surge. Landfall occurred at night, during the high tide, and during the full moon, which makes it the highest of high tides. It had never been this high before. The storm surge was measured at 5 meters and carried a remarkable 800 kilometers inland.
Down here, it is almost completely dark.
The storm was so powerful that the residents of New York City, the city that never sleeps, could only hunker down for a nap.
But downtown, it's clear the Big Apple took a big hit. Lower Manhattan, normally vibrant and bustling, now looking eerily like something out of a disaster movie.
Hoping to keep people safe, the city shut down mass transit.
The subway and other transport networks were shut down for days, a vanishingly rare occurrence for a system that usually runs 24/7 all year round. Large areas of Manhattan were flooded. Sandy was truly cataclysmic for the city. Across the eastern USA, 233 people died, 650,000 homes were destroyed, and 8 million people were left without power. Sandy caused $70 billion in property damage. The cost to the economy, measured in billions per day, was never calculated. For the scale of destruction, the loss of life was relatively low. Had this monster storm turned left instead of right, hitting the poorer Central American countries, the death toll would have been unimaginable. Cyclone recording keeping started in 957 AD. Since then, over 12,000 cyclones since have been recorded. Most of those didn't make this list, but there are a few notable storms that came close. These are the record breakers. Cyclone Olivia that hit Western Australia in 1996 has the fastest recorded wind gusts, reaching an incredible 420 kilometers per hour, which is faster than the speed of an F1 Indy car. In 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan devastated the Philippines. With winds estimated at 315 kilometers per hour, it is considered to be one of the strongest typhoons ever recorded in the region. On the islands, nothing could withstand its power and fury. Submerged Reunion Island in 1980.
Il pleut à verse sur le département.
Over a 2-week period, it dropped 6 meters of rain, which was more than Maria, Mitch, and Nina combined.
Car Hyacinthe l'imprévisible.
And last, in 1994, Hurricane John set the record for being both the longest lasting and the most traveled. John traveled from Africa to Central America, crossed over into the Pacific, and then traveled far enough west to be classified as a typhoon. Hurricane John lasted for an incredible 31 days and traveled 13,000 kilometers, all of it at sea. These are terrifying statistics, but the scariest part is that all these records will almost certainly be broken.
Idea to get out here at this hour.
So far, the damage and destruction we've seen has been largely unavoidable. But in some storms, there are human factors that contribute to the catastrophe. That was the case with our number 4, Typhoon Nina in China. Nina struck in the middle of the 1975 storm season. It had already caused considerable damage in Taiwan. before making landfall again in southern China. China is used to the sort of winds that come with typhoons. Nina's winds were relatively weak, clocking speeds of just 180 kilometers per hour. The province of Henan was totally devastated. On day 1, Nina dropped 1 meter of rain on China. That's more rain than a country like the UK expects to see in a full year. The deluge was enough to cause cataclysmic flooding and landslides. Henan province has hundreds of dams that were built to provide electricity to the region. They were built to rigorous standards and are expected to withstand the kind of rainfall that only happens once every 1,000 years. Those standards were nowhere near what they were being exposed to. Under the incredible extra weight of all that extra water, 62 of the region's dams collapsed, releasing massive walls of water that didn't simply flood. They wiped towns and villages off the map. 12,000 square kilometers of land, an area the size of Hawaii, was inundated with water. More than 30 cities were completely flooded and cut off from the rest of the world. The official death toll from Typhoon Nina stands at 240,000. Though some estimates put the figure over 1 million. The secrecy of the Chinese state likely means we'll never know the true figure. Damage costs for the destruction would venture into the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. For a truly industrialized country, it was an unparalleled level of devastation. The flooding and deaths were unavoidable given the historic rainfall. However, if the dams had not been there in the first place, the flooding would have been more catastrophic. China's engineers took every precaution. But steel and concrete don't stand a chance when confronted by the full brutal power of nature. Typhoon Nina showed unavoidable human failures, our number 3 demonstrates the damage that sheer negligence can cause. It's Cyclone Nargis from 2008. Asia is the real hotbed for cyclonic activity. The warm waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the near year-round warm air means that these areas are on constant alert for the next typhoon or cyclone. At least most countries are. When Cyclone Nargis formed in the Indian Ocean in April 2008, right at the very start of the region's storm season, Indian authorities warned all their neighbors to pay close attention. Most countries did. Indian fishermen moored their boats. Bangladeshi rice farmers hurriedly harvested for fear of food shortages. However, Myanmar's military rulers did nothing, and thousands of their citizens would pay the price. As with so many other cyclones, it wasn't the intensity of the winds that caused the biggest problems. The winds peaked at 215 kilometers per hour, but a number of factors combined to make this one of the deadliest cyclones on record. On the 2nd of May, Nargis made landfall near enough to the Irrawaddy Delta to cause a massive storm surge over 5 meters high. The water raced up and over the densely populated riverbanks and islands and traveled 50 kilometers upriver. The damage was cataclysmic. 95% of all buildings in the area were destroyed, and 90,000 people were killed.
The United Nations says it has made a formal offer to send an assistance, but the ruling military junta has not responded.
Additionally, 50,000 people from the area were declared missing and never found. Once the number of dead or missing reached 140,000 people, the authorities allegedly stopped counting. With so many dead and millions more made homeless, the need for assistance was paramount.
We provide potential for a tremendous capability. We stood ready, we were well trained, we were well briefed, and ready to execute at a moment's notice.
But the isolated junta resisted almost all outside offers of help.
Channel 4 News has obtained these new images of the desperation in La Puta, one of the most devastated areas of the Delta.
An already bleak situation was becoming worse as overrun sewage systems burst and destroyed all the crops on the Delta. Already without shelter, the survivors were now without food or clean water. After 2 long weeks, Myanmar's leaders finally allowed foreign assistance to enter the country, only to be thwarted by a massive earthquake in the southern area of China called Sichuan. The quake destroyed much of the area's roads and delayed valuable help even further. Fortunately, the scourge of diseases didn't reach the population as international organizations had feared. The strength of the storm surge and the poverty of the region meant that death and destruction on a large scale was almost inevitable. But it's impossible to say how many lives might have been saved had the junta given their people ample warning and allowed foreign aid to immediately help. Today, the official death toll of 138,000 makes it one of the deadliest cyclones on record. But there can be no doubt that the true figure is far higher. That was just the point at which they stopped counting. Some estimate the figure to be closer to 300,000. Cyclones rarely need help from people to recover. Sadly, this was an example of people making a bad situation worse. Even the richest countries on Earth can take nature's fury and make it worse. We present number 2 on our list from 2005, Hurricane Katrina.
Water's coming in the room through the air conditioning vent.
Katrina was the most famous and most filmed hurricane of all time.
Jim Reed and myself were in Gulfport.
Ironically, it wasn't the most powerful, most destructive, or most deadly hurricane to ever strike the United States. Katrina looked like a tropical storm that was fizzling out as it approached the Gulf of Mexico in August 2005. Then, favorable conditions saw it rapidly gain strength until it became a Category 5 storm with wind speeds of 280 kilometers per hour. Katrina suddenly and unexpectedly turned and headed towards the USA's Gulf Coast. Though the hurricane was downgraded to a Category 3, the authorities were quick to act.
Every person is hereby ordered to immediately evacuate the city of New Orleans.
A rarely seen mandatory evacuation order was issued in New Orleans, with those who chose to remain being warned to write their names and social security numbers on their thigh and permanent markers so authorities could identify their bodies.
I wish I had better news, but we are facing a storm that many fear.
And even though they were warned and knew what was coming, the results were still shocking.
We got a car that's getting ready to come right in the lobby now.
New Orleans was built 300 years ago on a natural bowl, with much of the area sitting below sea level. To prevent flooding, in the 1960s, the U.S. Army engineers constructed a series of levees that would control the water. They should have been built to a depth of 12 meters. But in an attempt to save money, they were built to only a depth of 6 meters instead of 12. Their failure was inevitable, and when faced with Katrina's storm surge, they failed quickly. In a matter of hours, 80% of New Orleans ended up under as much as 3 meters of water. Most had heeded the warning to flee. Some had chosen not to evacuate, and others had been unable to. We learned that completely evacuating a large city is a monumental challenge. Tens of thousands were left stranded in a flooded and abandoned city. The media broadcast live coverage to the world of the struggles of survivors, bringing the power of hurricanes into stark focus. This was a storm strong enough to bring a superpower country to its knees. Survivors huddled on whatever higher ground they could find. Some used overpasses, some used rooftops, and thousands gathered in the city's Superdome football stadium, which became hell on earth.
They've taken hours after hours to get here. We've been waiting hours. It's stinking out here. It's just disgusting and frustrating. And we are human beings, and they're treating us like we're criminals.
Violence erupted, and there wasn't enough security to stop it. We had rape victims, we had assault victims.
It's just hard for me to believe that this is America.
All right, so people here feeling scared about what this night's going to bring and feeling neglected by their government officials.
The rescue effort for the desperate began in earnest. In truth, it was part rescue and part salvage. Rescuers used boats to go from door to door in the submerged wards that housed the largely poor and black population of the city. All right. The walls of the searched houses would be marked with details of who had searched them and when, and if bodies or survivors were found. Though some mistakes were made. Many of these markings remain to this day, a stark reminder of one of the darkest points in recent American history. The final death toll was just over 1,800. Tragedy of that is surpassed by the fact that most of the deaths were avoidable. The cost, however, was monumental. The money for relief and recovery that is not yet complete was put in excess of $150 billion. This was the damage caused by a Category 3 hurricane. Ironically, had Katrina maintained its Category 5 status and 280-kilometer-per-hour winds, the damage could have been much worse. The aftermath of Katrina will be felt across Louisiana for decades to come. Many left New Orleans never to return. When certain neighborhoods were rezoned and gentrified, it forced the former residents who were poor to have to relocate. Katrina is evidence of how modern world circumstances can combine to create monumental disaster. If the hurricane hit hadn't been direct, the levees may not have been broken. If in the 1960s the levees had been properly built, at a cost of millions, they would likely have held and not led to damage that cost billions.
As you can see, the winds are
Despite not being one of the fastest, biggest, or deadliest hurricanes, Katrina is worthy of its place in our top 10. Katrina demonstrated that even in the 21st century, one of these storms can cripple one of the most powerful countries on the planet and almost totally destroy a modern city. Number 1, we have a cyclone that combines all the ingredients we've seen across the rest of the top 10. It was a perfect storm that led to one of the greatest human disasters of the modern world. It's the Bola cyclone of 1970. Bola was born in the North Indian Ocean and fluctuated between being a Category 1 and Category 3 storm as it moved its way through the Bay of Bengal and up towards Bangladesh. That area was called East Pakistan. The storm was strong, but by no means the most powerful cyclone of the year. Authorities were able to track it and had a good idea of where it was going to make landfall, but the government had closed the radio warning system, which meant that millions of people would get no warning. Bola made made landfall close to the Ganges Delta after sunset, around high tide, putting it in the worst possible place and at the worst possible time. The densely populated, low-lying islands of the delta were filled with hand-built shelters comprised of bamboo, palm fronds, and sheet metal. The dwellings offered no resistance to massive 6-meter surges. A wall of water the height of a 2-story house arrived without any warning and in the dark. It would have been as terrifying as it was remorseless. Entire islands were wiped clean of crops, livestock, and houses. Tens of thousands of people were washed out to sea, never to be found. Across the region, everything was battered by strong winds, accompanied by flooding and mudslides. Those who survived the initial onslaught were left in darkness, not knowing what had just happened, and unable to seek or help other survivors. Worse was still to come. As the bloated corpses of tens of thousands of victims and farm animals polluted the water supply, cholera and typhoid spread, causing even more death. The diet of those in the area was almost exclusively rice and fish. The cyclone had washed away almost all of the seasonal rice crop, and 60% of the fishing fleet had been destroyed. Between the initial impact and the diseases and hardship that followed, it's estimated that 500,000 people died, and another 50 million were displaced. Those numbers are hard to comprehend. Even for an area used to devastating floods and powerful cyclones, the scale of Ebola was unprecedented. Some estimates say 85% of homes in the area were badly damaged or destroyed. If the storm had just hit 100 kilometers further south, the loss of life would have been dramatically less. And if it had struck during the day, the population might have had a chance. The combination was fatal. Measuring only for its wind speed of 200 kilometers per hour, Ebola is one of the less powerful cyclones on this list. It was less than half the size of Sandy. Its rainfall was dramatically lower than Nina, Maria, or Mitch. But as a result of the unique circumstances and a gigantic storm surge, the death toll could be equal to the combined death toll of the other 9 storms on the list. Never before or since have we seen the circumstances of timing, location, human error, and poverty come together in such a way that created such total devastation. Hopefully, we never will again.
It's about 8:30, and we're going to tell you that parts of Ocean Drive are basically impassable. It's not
huge lights that have tumbled down onto.
Most of us are fortunate enough to have never encountered the formidable power of these tropical cyclones. But with sea temperatures rising the world over, the conditions that seed them are improving all the time.
Fast rising flash flood.
Warmer seas mean that we're seeing a longer storm season. Thus, stronger cyclones that stay strong longer are being produced. More storms means more time over land and more destruction. The 10 hurricanes we've seen here tonight could just be the beginning.